Divas. Oh, I am so excited about this week's episode. Yes, for all of you who weren't born yet, stick around. You've got a lot to learn. We are celebrating, commemorating, recognizing the 25th anniversary of the 2000 recount here in the Speakeasy with Barry Richard. He represented the Bush campaign. That's President George W. Bush campaign. And Craig Waters, he was the public information officer who was the face of the Florida Supreme Court. That guy with the megaphone on the steps of the court, that was him. Okay, we have so much to talk about. We'll hear all about hanging chads, litigation strategies, technology, the reporter that got run over by the satellite truck, and so much more. Please join me today for a deeper dive into the Bush v. Gore recount of 2000.
Everybody acted respectfully to each other. I mean, I understand what the public face was that was being used, but the lawyers were all respectful to each other. Nobody accused anybody else of being engaged in corruption.
You're listening to Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by the News Service of Florida. Let's dive in.
Divas, oh my gosh, I am thrilled to have, yes, they are two of my OGs. They have been around for a minute, and we all, I guess we trauma bonded back in 2000 during the 2000 recount. Barry Richard, a constitutional lawyer who is attorney par none here based in Tallahassee, he was representing the Bush campaign in front of the Florida Supreme Court, and Craig Waters was the public information officer for the Florida Supreme Court. He was the guy with the megaphone that you saw, that all those pictures that you saw, he herded all of us report. And I was a reporter for the Associated Press. So welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you.
One of the reasons we're doing this is because it is the 25th anniversary of that historic recount and that historic election. And I was just wondering, I thought I was doing an event last week, actually. You corrected me on what this actual name of it is. I think it is the American Appellate. Now I'm going to butcher it again. The First American Appellate District Court of Inn.
Oh, you're talking about the Inn of Court.
Inn of Court. Damn it.
Yeah, it's the Inn of Court. It's the First District Court of Appeal, Inn of Court.
Yes. Gosh, I really did butcher that. And it was a great event. And it was about the recount. And we had Judge Clay Roberts was part of that, and retired Judge Terry Lewis. The moderator was the acting Solicitor General, who was Jeffrey D'Souza, who was 13 at the time of the recount. And there was actually one of the young attorneys in the audience got up and said, he wasn't born yet when it happened. So I do think, and I've been doing, when I speak to young people, always part of my shtick, and when I talk about myself, is I include the recount, covering the recount. And I see now that I get glazed looks when I talk about that. There are many people, I think, who don't realize what a significant moment in our history that was. And so I wanted to start with that, what you think the biggest lessons learned were, and if you think, how you think that changed elections and litigation elections going forward.
Well, the one thing that I saw, Dara, was what happened during Bush v. Gore 25 years ago was a very active use of public relations to try to influence what was going on in the courts. That was something I had dealt with at a minimal level at the Florida Supreme Court as the spokesman and the communications director. But I was quite amazed at this public relations machinery that came in from Washington, D.C. To try to create a narrative that fit the particular perspectives of each candidate. And of course, the narrative that seemed to prevail over the long term was the one that was produced by Jim Baker and the Republicans, which was that the Florida Supreme Court was a runaway court, determined to throw the election to Al Gore. Now, I was inside the court for the entire period and worked there, for quite some time before that, and I was flabbergasted that this narrative was being produced, because from the inside, that's not what I was seeing at all. What I was seeing was a court that was trying to adhere to precedent that was state law precedent, which governs these elections, that was more than 100 years old, and that basically said that every vote should be counted. And that was the precedent the Florida Supreme Court was applying. And so this narrative that was being produced by the Republican Party tried to move away from that perspective to the one of the runaway court. And I think they succeeded in this public relations effort to a large degree.
They succeeded. I'm curious to what you think about that, Barry, because to some extent, perhaps they succeeded in convincing the U.S. Supreme Court that that's what had happened in Florida.
That was not my impression. I think that the U.S. Supreme Court, I wrote an article afterwards because both courts were being criticized for having been acted corruptly, which I don't think either court did. I mean, judges, by their nature, they're appointed largely because of their ideological background, and they're going to be affected by it because it colors how they approach issues. I think the critical question in terms of corruption is whether a judge is able to overcome preconceived prejudices to rule on the facts of the law before him or her. And I think I wrote an article afterwards called "In Defense of Two Supreme Courts." It was in the University of Florida Journal. And my argument was that both courts followed their precedents and acted, I thought, honorably. But there's a bigger issue here that I want to address, which is you talked about young people today who were either children or not alive at the time. Incidentally, I've been surprised the other way at how many of them are aware of Bush v. Gore.
Good.
Have studied it, but they didn't live through it. And so they're living in a time which I think could be maybe the lowest time of politics, at least since the revolution. And they think this is how it is and has always been, which it isn't. And if you were alive and following things and old enough to follow them during Bush v. Gore, you know that there's a drastic difference in politics today. I mean, I don't disagree with the fact that, and incidentally, when I met with James Baker, when I first began representing them, I said to him, I don't want to have any involvement in any political stuff. I'm just the lawyer, and all I want to do is legal stuff. And he committed to me that he wouldn't put me in a position of that happening, and he honored it. He asked me to be by his side at all press conferences except one, when he said to me, this can be very political and you don't want to be there.
Interesting. And
anytime I was asked by a reporter a question that touched on politics, my answer was, I'm just the lawyer.
I know, yes.
And so that's just a side. But the point is, everybody acted respectfully to each other. I mean, I understand what the public face was that was being used, but the lawyers were all respectful to each other. Nobody accused anybody else of being engaged in corruption. We all got along. And matter of fact, we were all having a good time. When I first met David Boies, he and I shook hands, and we enjoyed each other. And it happened that right in the middle of all of it was my wife's and my anniversary, which became public knowledge. And David Boies and his legal team, the Today Show did a day in the life where they followed both of us, and they all toasted us on our anniversary.
Wow.
You may remember that there were people on both sides of the courthouse, but in the road Monroe, which runs between the courthouse and the Capitol.
Yes.
One side was the Gore people all day with their signs chanting. The other side was the Bush people. And at night, because right in the middle of all of it, we had the lighting festival. Everybody went out together and partied.
Yeah, it was. Yes.
Can you imagine that today?
No, that would not happen today.
And then, most importantly, when it was over, after it was hard fought, Gore conceded.
Yes, he
and
did.
He rode in the limousine to the swearing in with Bush, as has done in memorable history, and he sat beside him. That always gave me goosebumps because I think it's such an extraordinary illustration of the peaceful passage of power.
Absolutely.
That doesn't happen or hasn't happened since Trump came along.
It's very different. It's very different. And I really appreciate that distinction between having lived through this experience. And it's one of my questions I was going to ask was, because for me as a reporter, it was the beginning of my career as a reporter. I was a late bloomer, and it had a significant impact on how I viewed the courts, how I viewed the political system, the relationship. It really solidified my relationship with you, my relationship with both of you, actually. I realized I began to really fully appreciate the significance of relationships in reporting and trusting people and being trusted, because we were getting this was like pre-internet almost. And I want to talk about the technology, the advances in technology and how that affected what you were doing. But to live through that and know consciously at the time that you were participating, sort of vicariously or as the third rail to history. I mean, we knew that history was being made, right? Like there was no question about it. And there was so much the energy and the excitement. I'm looking for words to describe what went on here in Tallahassee for that month-long period with the reporters from all around the world. I mean, you can speak a little bit to that, but
yeah, it was definitely a very electric sensation going on for 37 days.
Yes. So I guess that was a long way of saying, in what way do you think we've changed, or do you think that the recount was the catalyst for, other than getting rid of hanging chads? In what way was that the catalyst for some of what we're seeing today?
I view it as the start of the slippery slope. I really do. And, Dara, I completely agree with you about the importance of public institutions having trustful relationships with the press. That was something I went out of my way to do during the 35 years that I worked at the Florida Supreme Court as its communications director. And I knew all of you, even the out-of-town press that came in from New York and Tokyo and Paris and Moscow. I tried to get to know all of these reporters. At the very first, by going out and just talking with them, and then by holding regular press briefings where we could have an off-the-record exchange just to get to know each other a little better. Now come and look at today, and distrust seems to be the mood in government relations with the press in so many quarters. And I think we've lost something now, because when government no longer seems to trust the press and treats them as the enemy and treats them as something to be ignored or even manipulated, then you lose a great deal of the relationship that you and I developed, and I developed with so many other reporters during Bush v. Gore, which I think served the public good in a big way by making sure that good information got out and not just one side was presented.
Right, because we are not lawyers. And we're not court administrators. And so we really need that interpretation. We need people to explain to us what was happening. And election law, correct me if I'm wrong, you guys, but election law is a very complicated, esoteric part of law. And it was kind of developing.
In the United States, it certainly is very complicated. The one big question I kept getting from all quarters, the press, the public, everywhere, was why does Florida law govern this? Well, it's because the U.S. Constitution says that each state establishes its own rules for presidential elections. And so many people simply did not understand that aspect of the Constitution, something that has been in the Constitution since it was written. And one of the things that I was trying to do as I was dealing with other people's narratives about what the Florida Supreme Court was doing was to get out this information that somehow had been lost to the public through the years, that they didn't know that Florida law governed. They didn't know that the Florida Supreme Court is the final authority on Florida law, and that was why the case was being litigated all the way to the Florida Supreme Court and only later went to the U.S. Supreme Court. I knew there was a learning curve from the very beginning. And I look, today is...
Well, you're an attorney, so that
I am an attorney,
probably
yes.
helped you to understand how complicated it was.
Right. The election was on November 7th. And then, 25 years ago today, we were getting ready for the first big oral argument at the Florida Supreme Court.
Right.
And so, I had a very short period of time to try to get useful information out there. And I was very lucky that I had justices, really a unanimous court behind me with this effort to try to educate the public about what was going on here. Who were these 7 judges in Florida? What were the rules and how were they determined? Who had the final say? And so, I was constantly dealing with these questions, and I very gladly, openly, and happily tried to convey as much information as I could, because I believe that openness was the only way we could get beyond the political PR campaigns that were being used behind the scenes. Especially this narrative about the Florida Supreme Court.
Well, Barry said he didn't think that there was that the courts acted politically.
I think the courts did their best. I was really taken aback by Sandra Day O'Connor's comments during one of the oral arguments, expressing a kind of disdain for the Florida Supreme Court. That kind of comment is not something I'm accustomed to hearing from judges on the highest courts in a jurisdiction. And so, but I especially was dealing with the press. And I can't tell you all the times the press came to me behind the scenes with these outrageous stories.
And that's what I was just going. I love this when you lead in, when my guests lead into a question that I'm about to ask. I was going to ask, what was the most challenging rumor or piece of misinformation that you had to deal with?
Well, the craziest of all was the one that the opinion had been written in advance before the oral argument was even held. That shows just a sublime ignorance of how appellate courts work. Because appellate courts have lots of staff attorneys who assist them. And the job of these staff attorneys is to prepare memoranda in advance, stating as fully as they can all of the applicable law and how they might apply to the facts of each particular case. So yes, we were following the normal procedure and having these memoranda done. And there were 7 sets of these memoranda for each justice, because each justice was having them prepared. These memoranda necessarily would address what the particular staff attorney thought should go into a final opinion. But I can guarantee you that you take all 7 of the memoranda that were prepared, they wouldn't necessarily agree with each other. And they very rarely are reflected in their entirety in the final opinion that the court releases. So, someone got a hold of some information, apparently, I assume, about these memoranda, and twisted it around to say that the Florida Supreme Court had a single opinion written in advance, which was just untrue. And this came directly from one of the Republican operatives who was at the Florida Supreme Court at the time. And he went out to brief the press, about this development that he felt he had found. Oh, wow. So all of a sudden, I had hundreds of reporters asking me if this was true.
Can you name names?
I don't remember which one it was. It was, I can remember his picture, but I can't remember his name.
We'll have to do a mug shots with you after the show. What about you? Did you feel like there was rumor or misinformation? I know you were focusing on the litigation, or that was your job, but did you have to like tell your team, no, this isn't happening, or did they bring any of that kind of thing to you?
First of all, I actually didn't have a team. The Republican, the people that were involved were at the Republican headquarters, and I intentionally stayed away from it because you can't get any work done. I had 40. I was managing 47 cases, literally 47 cases, state court, and I had like a whole series of briefcases in my office with stuff. And the other problem
my God! Did you have 47 briefcases?
No, I didn't have 47 briefcases. But the point is, you had said that this was a complicated law.
Yes.
More than being complicated, it was a law that nobody had dealt with since 1876.
Wow.
And so consequently, all of us were operating in the dark. And usually in a big trial, you work late into the night to prepare for the next day.
Right.
We didn't have anything to prepare for because we never knew what was happening the next day.
Oh, right.
I got a call one day from... it was one of the judges on the Tallahassee Circuit Court.
Would have been Nikki Clark or Judge Sauls or Judge Lewis.
I think it was Judge Clark.
Yeah.
And her assistant said, the judge wants everybody in the courtroom at 2:00 today. And I said, what's it about? She said, I don't know. And I walked in the courtroom, and the courtroom, as you will remember, was filled with reporters
of course.
All the time.
Yes.
And it was one TV camera that was sending a feed to all of the TV.
But we were all in the hallway.
Correct. And I walked in the courtroom.
Down the gauntlet.
Judge wasn't there yet. And I said to the reporters, does anybody know what this is about? And nobody did. So the point is, we were operating different than in any other case.
And we'll be right back with Craig Waters and Barry Richard. Divas, you know what time it is. What time is it? It's time for the news in haikus. The news in haikus. 25 years hence. Butterfly ballots and hanging chads. Bush wins Florida. The news in haikus. Don't forget, we'd love to hear your haiku. You can slide them into my DMs, or you can send them to podcasts, that's podcasts with an S, at e.newsserviceflorida.com. Wherever you're listening, please don't forget to subscribe and give us a rating if you like what we're doing. And we're back with Craig Waters and Barry Richard talking about the 2000 recount. I want to talk about technology because Craig had introduced the internet to, I think you had started posting opinions online.
In 1996, yes.
So before this happened, a lot of people didn't have good cell phones. There wasn't good cell phone service. I had a BlackBerry, which I loved. Certainly there wasn't a repository of old cases online, I think, in the way that there is now. I don't know how robust Westlaw was at the time, but how much did the having to schlep, paper pieces of paper, get them printed or whatever. How did the technology affect what you were doing litigation wise?
Well, we did have Westlaw, and we had Lexis, and it had been around for years, and it was very robust.
Okay, that's good.
So there was no problem researching the law. What I was going to say is I just stayed away from what was going on with rumors and
you did
and politics. I didn't have time. I didn't want to anyway, as I said, but I didn't have time for it. I was preparing for as well as could be prepared. One day I had, because these 47 cases were all over the state, and the problem is I had other lawyers, some really fine lawyers. When I said I didn't have a team, that were on the same side as I was and were available. But when you're dealing with 47 cases and you're dealing with a law that there has been 100 years of non-development, and so nobody knows where you're headed, you can't afford to send different lawyers to different hearings because of the problem with getting inconsistent positions being taken.
Right.
So to the extent possible, I had to argue everything myself.
Right.
A lot of them I did. We didn't have Zoom at that time. A lot of them I did by telephone. And
Right.
as an example, one day I was arguing to a judge, I think it was Judge Labarga, as a matter of fact, who at the time was a sitting circuit judge. And I had another judge that somebody was holding on a phone in another office. So when I finished with that one, I'd go in and I could argue the other one. So that's how it was like these entertainers to see who are spinning a bunch of plates.
That's
and
wild.
Keep all the plates spinning.
I never thought about that, what it was like to manage all those cases.
Well, and then in the evening, because there was no preparation, I had 2-year-old twins. I used to go home in the evening and help put the twins to bed. But then one thing was the media was extraordinarily respectful. Nobody ever bothered me at home. I
didn't bother you at home. I can't believe that.
I had a paralegal who walked everywhere with me. By the way, you had mentioned people from all over the world. I would walk out my door and there would be a mass of reporters and cameramen and microphones. It looked like the Olympic Village from all over the world.
Yeah.
And when I walked somewhere, they would be walking backwards in front of me. So
That's right. And you're just walking, and this scrum of reporters, and some of them not even saying anything, just like you're walking, and they're recording you.
And we had, I think, 26 satellite dishes around the Capitol.
Yeah.
The day afterwards, by the way, everything was gone. It was back to being a quiet little village again. But that's what we were dealing with, and so there was no time to pay any attention to the politics. But I do want to comment for a minute on the politics and something you said. I agree with you that media had some involvement in what's happened. I mean, the extremists have always been there, but social media has enabled them to find each other.
Which didn't exist at the time.
It didn't exist at the time.
I agree with that.
The second thing is, I think things always trickle down from the top. And the thing is that even though Gore and Bush and Cheney, even though they fought a hard battle, they had like every president in my memory before that, they had an essential belief, a commitment to fundamental American principles. And they were not going to step beyond that. I mean, I think the one who might have come the closest to it was Nixon. Interestingly, Nixon resigned when his own party said they were going to vote to impeach them, something unheard of today.
Yeah.
But I think that what happened was they believed that when they lost, I mean, it was like, 47 votes ultimately?
And
no, 576 votes.
547.
547.
They believed that when it was over, they had an obligation to the sanctity of the system not to challenge it. I mean, they did everything legally that they were entitled to do, but they were not going to deny its validity once it was decided. Every court accepted the decision of a higher court without any question. The candidates accepted the final decision. And consequently, I had a reporter, might have been you, I had a reporter say to me in the midst of all of it, do you think either candidate will be able to govern when this is over?
Yeah.
And I said, we have a very stable democracy. When this is over, everybody's going to go back to work and we're going to have a president. And that's going to be the end of it. I don't believe that today. And
that's chilling. I mean, you talk about
it is chilling. And it's because since the first president, George Washington, the candidates and the officials have felt that there was a line they wouldn't overstep, which is to challenge the fundamental principles of this democracy. So even if they might have believed it was stolen from them, they weren't going to say that. That's gone.
Yeah, it is gone.
And it trickles down from the top. So then you have everybody
And
thinks
then
it's
you
okay
undermine,
now.
and then you undermine faith in the system.
That's
you
correct.
undermine faith in the election system, and then
that starts
people
a vicious
think
cycle.
it really does, because then people think, well, why? I don't care. It doesn't matter if I vote, so they don't vote. And part of that is then we only get the extremists coming out and voting, or that might happen. But the idea that the courts are corrupt, that the election system is corrupt. I mean, I've been covering elections in Florida for 30 years. And these folks in Florida, to a person, every single supervisor of election that I have ever spoken with or met, and their workers, were committed to open, fair elections that allowed people to cast their ballot. They wanted people to be able to vote. I don't know a lot of the newer ones, and I think we have a little more, maybe some are more politically leaning than they were certainly at the time. But where we're at now, there's no line in the sand, I think, that people aren't willing to cross to propel their own belief system. I don't want to call it, like, I think it's what they think is true, or maybe they don't even care if it's true.
Well, because they've been given permission to do that,
Right,
by
the
people
top
above them. The other perspective, which I think is interesting and a lot of average people are not aware of, is elections are a messy business, especially in this country.
And they always have been.
And in this country where there's in a national election, it's so dispersed. You got a different system, not only in 50 states, but in the localities of all the states. By the way, it's very difficult, I think, to affect a large election with corruption because of how many different people running different systems you would have to have in the conspiracy, which is virtually impossible to do.
I know.
The point is, we know that we don't always get it right. Not necessarily because people are corrupt, but because votes get screwed up.
Because human beings make errors.
So it's very likely, especially when it comes down to local stuff, that there are elections that are not the way they really should have ended up. Just not because anybody did it on purpose, just got screwed up. Now it happens. It's easier to happen at the local level, where you're not dealing with so many votes. But then what was unusual about Bush v. Gore is you were dealing with the number of votes that make a difference in a local mayor's race.
Right.
And because of the way our system works with the Electoral College, it can elect or unelect a president.
Yeah.
The point is, because what I'm trying to get at here is because we all know deep down inside that we can't be sure that every election is electing the person who really got the most votes. Incidentally, we don't elect the president by the most popular vote anyway.
Right. We don't.
But because we don't ever know that, we recognize that what we have to respect is that it is a system that was fair. And even if it elects the wrong person, because of some screw up in the county or some screw up in the...
Or something like the butterfly ballot.
Yeah, whatever it is. Yeah, that's true. Gore would have been president if it hadn't been for what happened in Palm Beach
County.
And everybody knows that.
Yes.
But so the point is, we respect the fact that we believed at the time that the system itself is the best system anybody's come up with. And that we are going to respect the result. Because if we don't, then we don't have a system that anybody can believe in. So that's so critical to a democratic process being stable.
Yeah, Dara, I looked up on my phone on Google, the attorney who had said that the opinion was written in advance, or the Republican operative, I should say, was Ben Ginsburg. Ben Ginsburg. And I recognize he was not Jim Baker,
right?
But him going to the press at the Florida Supreme Court to make this outrageously untrue statement was the kind of spin that we now see has become the norm.
It's been normalized, yeah,
Right.
Yeah. And You were talking about it being the sort of precursor for where we're at today and this kind of tribal politics, I think, and kind of win at any cost, I think is kind of what you
Right.
were indicating. And where we're at now, coming from the top, those kinds of messages, it's interesting because I think that we were on that arc and then 9/11. And then we all came together after 9/11. And I think that we were unified in a way that the country hadn't been since the recount.
Yeah.
And now we are, maybe back at the other end of that spectrum.
Yeah, although 9/11 did add another element. In Florida, this is not well known. We had to prepare in 2004 just in case Bush v. Gore happened here again, and I went to all kinds of meetings trying to get ready with FDLE and law enforcement of all types, along with our marshal's staff. And they told me at the very start, there will be no gatherings. You are not going to go out on the front steps and make announcements. If you make announcements, you will do it from inside the court building with a small select group of reporters. Because we cannot afford after 9/11 to draw crowds like we did in 2000.
Do you think that was the real reason, or do you think they couldn't afford another spectacle like they had?
I think that was the real reason. I mean, I was talking with these people back then, and I did not sense there was any political motive behind this.
Well, I was inside the Capitol on 9/11 with Governor, and Governor Bush was governor at the time, and his brother was president,
Right.
And so there was a lot of concern about was Florida going to be a target because of the brother of the
Right.
president was governor of this state.
I was right across the street at the Florida Supreme Court. We were worried too.
I know, and there have been a lot of changes since then. So I guess the technological thing though, were you having to do a lot more paper filing and run things over to the court, or have your runners run things over to the court, or was that not an issue for you?
No, we were filing paper filings, which we don't do anymore. It was
Right.
after that the court said that unless you're unrepresented by a lawyer, you have to file
Right.
electronically in both the federal and state level. At that time, it was still paper.
Yeah, it was.
Let me comment for a minute about this opinion being written beforehand, because I
Yes.
was asked about that when it was
Sure.
going on. And my response was, I doubt it, but it doesn't matter because it wouldn't have been anything wrong with it. Seriously, I mean, by the time it reaches the court, they've already
Right.
got briefs. They've already know what the issues is. If a
Right.
judge wants, and I think it's probably not unusual sometimes for a judge to start writing a draft because
Sure.
it's going to, and by the way, this was all happening so fast
Yeah,
and the courts had to act so quickly. Courts don't have to have oral argument.
that's right.
They don't have to
They
listen to
don't
anything.
a lot of times.
And what happens is, and Craig knows this better than I do, is you got 7 justices and they can all write their own opinions. And there's a lot of negotiation going
Yeah.
on.
You could have 7 opinions written.
I was
That's
going to
okay.
say you could have had 7
Well, and they're also
opinions written.
trying to persuade each other. So one of the judges might want to write the majority opinion, and
Right.
you might go to one of the judges who doesn't agree and say, well, if I change this in it, would you then vote for me on this opinion?
Right.
Or vice versa. What I don't like your opinion is this. If you're
Yeah.
willing to rewrite that. That's why sometimes it takes so long to get an opinion.
Well,
What I'm saying is, if a draft had been prepared, as long as the justices were doing what they believed was right based upon the law and the facts, it doesn't matter that they had a draft beforehand.
Well, anybody who's read an opinion where there's a dissent knows that the majority opinion oftentimes will address the dissent.
Criticize the dissent,
So
or the
those,
dissent might.
Yeah, but
so
I mean,
somehow those opinions are shared before they're released to the public. So
I know
my point is, there's no rule that says the opinion can't be written until
Yeah.
after the hearing.
Yeah. It's silly,
And
right?
Barry is absolutely right about that. That's one reason why I felt that what Ben Ginsburg was doing was so incredibly misleading. Honestly, I was surprised that the Bush campaign did not do something to retract that, because it does not reflect reality, what
Yeah.
Ben Ginsburg said.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to comment. I liked Ben Ginsburg and I enjoyed working with him. I didn't hear that part.
Okay.
I suspect he might have gotten carried away with the wave of what was going on.
It was a heady time for a lot of people.
But I just want to I don't want to.
We're not going to let him just go undefended.
Yeah, I like Ben. I thought he was an honorable person.
All right. There we go. What do you think was the single most pivotal legal argument your team developed or deployed during the litigation that you believe turned the tide in your favor?
Well, first of all, the Florida Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court didn't really clash, number one. We made a strategic decision not to raise federal issues in the Florida Supreme Court. The reason we did that, incidentally, and I don't want to get into too esoteric a discussion of this federal system, but we wanted to keep the door open to possibly getting to the U.S. Supreme Court. And you can't get to the U.S. Supreme Court if you raise the issue at the state court. It has to, but without getting into the details of why, we intentionally.
So you wanted to preserve.
We
those
didn't
issues.
give the Florida. We had a decision. We had gone to the federal court and district court, and that decision out of South Florida had gone to the 11th Circuit. And the 11th Circuit had said, well, we're going to hold off on this till we see what the Florida courts do. So we wanted to keep that in case we needed it.
In your back
so we didn't
pocket.
raise the U.S., we didn't raise the federal question there. And the result was that ultimately when we went to the federal court, to the U.S. Supreme Court on the federal question, there was no Florida decision on a federal question. So the Florida Supreme Court made a decision based upon its precedent on Florida law.
Right.
The U.S. Supreme Court ultimately ruled for Bush based upon equal protection, essentially. I mean, it was what we were talking about. It was a series of separate opinions, but 5 of them ended up saying it was an equal protection violation. The reason for that, by the way, and I don't want to get too far on the side. The reason for that was...
Let's talk about that.
Well, the reason was because the counties were adopting different methods of counting the chads. So David Boies, who was my opposing lawyer and who was wonderful too, and I enjoyed opposing him, he went to Palm Beach County and to Broward County to convince them to adopt a very liberal posture for counting a chad. He was successful in Broward County, not in Palm Beach County.
For let me just for a second, for our divas that were born that were born after 2010, Chad was the little piece of hanging paper they had punch ballots, and when you punched through, whether that piece of paper that came out of the hole was actually came out, or whether it was just hanging and partially removed.
Don't forget the pregnant chads.
Or there was
incidentally those ballots were one of the reasons that nobody knows who won that election.
That's right.
You know, when they ran
poor Teresa Lepore.
It was a long ballot. Well, hers was different. Hers was terrible. But she was trying to do it.
She was butterfly ballots.
Right. But all of the others were these long cards.
That's right.
And you'd have this thing called a stylus, which had a little point on it, and you would punch it through a little hole as to which candidate you wanted.
That's right.
And then the question was, what if it didn't completely come off? That was called a hanging chad. You could see it was punched, but it was just hanging off.
Right.
Or what if you could see a dimple in it?
That was a pregnant chad.
What if they pushed it in the wrong place? So the other thing, incidentally, is when they did the recount and they ran them through the machines again, there were hundreds of those things on the floor afterwards. So nobody really knows what the recount told us. And again, everybody said, okay, we have a result here.
Okay, so I didn't mean to interrupt you, but you were talking about the equal protection and what Boies did.
What happened was he was successful. This was a Pyrrhic victory for him. He was successful in getting Broward County to take a very liberal standard. They said anything that indicates what the voter wanted to do, we're going to count. Palm Beach County was very conservative, which, by the way, was Judge Labarga, who interestingly has now become the liberal on the court.
He's the Don Quixote on the court.
But he was dealing with a policy that had been adopted by his board years before.
That's
right. It was very
right.
conservative. So what the court pointed out, what the U.S. Supreme Court pointed out, was the result of this was that in the final analysis, Palm Beach County, Broward County was counting 60 of the rejected ballots, because when you put these things through the machine, it would reject ballots that it determined wasn't properly punched.
Right. So if it was not all the way through.
In Palm Beach County, it was rejecting 60 times the number that were being rejected in Broward County.
I forgot that.
And the U.S. Supreme Court said, that's a violation of equal protection. You are giving the people in Broward County 60 times more voting power.
Right.
There was nothing wrong with that decision. It was fair. And it didn't conflict with anything that the Florida Supreme Court was called upon to say. So you had two decisions that were not unreasonable. Incidentally, that was 5 justices, including the liberal justices, who agreed with the equal protection issue in the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's what happened. And nobody was corrupt, and nobody was trying to turn the election, which then brings us to the last election. And there were 2 things, I think, that saved our democracy.
In 2000, I think you're talking about.
No, now I'm talking about
2024?
2024.
Okay.
2 things saved us from losing our democracy. One of them was that there were enough Republican leaders that were unwilling to take that step of refusing to certify the election. That was a step too far from them. Those people were heroes. They truly were. And I didn't...
Oh, you're talking about 2020. I'm sorry. 2020, when Biden won.
2016 and 20...
When Biden won.
Yeah,
2020.
when Biden won, they didn't want to certify his election.
Right.
Including the vice president, who I didn't personally like, but he had the guts, which probably ruined his political career, to say, I'm not going there. That's the first thing that saved him.
I mean, they threatened his life as a result of it, I believe.
He refused to do that.
That's right.
And you need to respect the result, even if you don't like it.
What about ending the counting? The question was, like, should they keep counting the ballots until all the ballots are counted? Because as I said, I was on this panel with Judge Lewis the other day, and he was saying that he thought that the Supreme Court, and I don't want to speak for him, but that he believed that we here in Leon County, they were getting prepared to recount the ballots from all over. He thought that those ballots should have been counted before there was a decision made to end the election.
Okay, let me get to that. But I had said there were 2 things to say about democracy. I just want to give you the second thing.
Okay, I'm sorry. I keep interrupting.
Without exception, the judges who reviewed the claims of corruption, Republican and Trump-appointed judges as well, said there was no corruption.
Every
this
one
was
of those
a valid
cases,
election.
Every one of those cases.
Those judges are heroes.
Yeah.
Because they refused to let our democracy be destroyed.
Thank you for...
Well, they saved us.
Yeah.
Okay, now getting to...
Sorry, no, those are important points, and I don't want to gloss over them, because I don't know about you all, but I have a lot of anxiety about next year's elections and the 2028 elections because of those backstops, because of the people who are in power now, and of the I don't want to call it the tail wagging the dog, but because there are so many people who believe that the election that President Trump lost was stolen, despite the reasons why that you just laid out for why it wasn't. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm still concerned that those backstops that we had 5 years ago may not be in place in going forward.
Yeah, well, we're all concerned about that. Well, I don't want to ignore the question you asked.
Thank you.
And I think there's some interesting, at least to me, interesting aspects to it.
Sure.
the reason that the vote was stopped when it was, I think, on a Saturday night by Scalia, I thought that was the one thing that I thought was completely inappropriate.
Yes.
He stepped in because what happens when you file an emergency motion, there's a judge who is on call for handling them, and he was the one. I think he was the one, but in any case, he signed an order and stopped the counting. I saw no basis for that at all. Everything else that I said I defended, I thought both courts did right, not that. But as it turns out, it didn't make any difference. I was asked, for an interesting reason, I was asked by a reporter at some point how I thought it was going to turn out. And I said, it doesn't matter anymore. And all this stuff that we're doing, that everybody's watching all over the world, it's really irrelevant. And the reason it is because of the way the system, which was adopted after the screw up back in the 1800s, works is that, and by the way, you can only count up to a point, at which point it's a certain day.
Right.
It has to stop. And the Supreme Court said, we have arrived at that point, and that's why it was over. But the reason it didn't matter anymore is because here's how it works. When a public official who has the apparent authority to act sends a delegation to Washington for the Electoral College, because what you do is you select people who represent the candidate and their names go to Washington. They don't actually really sit down and vote and stuff. They send it to Washington, and that's where it stays. If you have a second official, like the Florida Supreme Court, who says, no, that was wrong, it should be a Gore delegation who goes. They don't bring back the first one. They send the second one. Now you have two opposing delegations in Washington. And what the law says is that if both houses of Congress can agree on which one should be seated, that's the one. If they cannot agree, which they never would have agreed here, they never would have had agreement on it, it goes to the governor of the state to make the decision, which was Jeb Bush. So the point is that by the time, once that first delegation went to Washington, it was over. There was nothing that was going to make a difference. Because even if the Supreme Court, there had been a recount, the Supreme Court had sent a new one there, it would have ended up at best before Jeb Bush. So it's not that it's important. It's just an interesting little aspect of what was going on.
Yeah, yeah.
I never knew any of this stuff before 2000.
Well, hopefully you'll never have to use it again. Let me go back to the court in Florida, because we were talking about they all had different opinions, or they had opinions written. What was it like? Could you pull back the curtain a little bit and tell us what the feeling was among the justices as they were gathering and conferencing and, hashing out what was going on? What was it like inside the court, not the courtroom, but inside the court with the justices?
Well, up on the fourth floor of the Supreme Court building, which is where the chambers are located for the justices, you had staff attorneys that were literally sleeping on the floor at night, and so they could get up and start working right away in the morning. The justices, of course, had other business to attend to. People forget, for example, that there were 2 death warrants signed during the period of the Bush v. Gore challenge. So business like that can't stop. It has to go forward. Security, of course, was the tightest we have ever had at the Supreme Court building. You literally could not leave the building any hour of the day without being confronted by somebody. And that changed all the time, who the demonstrators were. I remember one time we were surrounded by a group called the simulcasters, who had satellite dishes strapped on their backs and were surrounding the building. Obviously that's rather strange. I don't remember them. When I had to go home to get some sleep, because I did not sleep at the court, security literally had to take me to my car because I had to go through this line of simulcasters. There were there were all kinds of unusual people. There was a lady with a trained skunk who was trying to get on the national television. There were advertisers realized they could get free publicity simply by driving or running their signs or driving their vehicles past the many worldwide TV cameras that were there. One day I looked out and there was a local septic tank company that was repeatedly driving one of its pump trucks around so that they could get some free advertisement.
Oh my gosh!
It was just this feeling of we had a lot of work to do in a short period of time, and everybody was pulling together. The court back then was divided between a conservative group and a more progressive group.
Right.
Although those terms have really been redefined since that period of time. Even though
who was Chief Justice?
The Chief Justice was Charlie Wells,
okay,
who was considered to be probably the most conservative member at that particular point in time. By today's standards, I think he would not be considered conservative.
True.
But just keep in mind the definition of conservative and liberal were different back then than they are today.
That's right.
But even though these people were disagreeing sometimes very loudly, and if you walked past the conference room, you could hear them talking very loudly. Everybody got along. Everybody realized we were in this together. There was this sense of we were working on a very noble effort and trying to achieve the result that was dictated by Florida law, not by the wills of any particular justice and not by any political perspective. That was one reason why I think I was so deeply taken aback by the efforts to spend the Florida Supreme Court in the public eye, the way that it occurred, because that was not the reality I was seeing inside the court, and I was there the whole time.
I was wondering though, afterwards, was there, after the U.S. Supreme Court, or after, like I said, we trauma bonded in a way, was there a feeling, did that event bring everyone closer together or farther apart, or have no impact on the justices and their relationships?
I think there was a sense of deflation. I remember one of the justices, after the final opinion from the U.S. Supreme Court had come out, one of the justices came and stood in my door and said, "All that work we did."
Oh, right, for not.
And because there was this sense of that we felt like we had done the right thing, and then for the U.S. Supreme Court to come along and say no, you didn't, was very much a letdown. You can't work that intensely over a period of more than a month without becoming invested to some degree with what you're doing. And no judge likes to be reversed. I mean, that's true across the board and in any situation. But this was one where the Florida Supreme Court really did believe that it was doing what was required by Florida law. The equal protection argument was a novel one that was barely mentioned before the Florida Supreme Court. And for that to become the decisive factor in the U.S. Supreme Court really was a stretch, I thought.
Barry, he's opening his mouth. He's not saying anything. Come on, respond.
No, I don't disagree. I think that I did not. I think the only extent to which I disagree with Craig, I thought that the opinion, to the extent that it addressed equal protection, was a fairly written opinion because of the statistic that I gave you between Palm Beach and Broward County. Also, incidentally, I've argued before the U.S. Supreme Court 4 times, and one of the impressions that I've gotten, the reason that they have a questionable attitude towards the Florida Supreme Court, which is not the only one, is they don't think much of Supreme Court whose justices are elected. they think that it's too politically oriented, and I had a case before them on behalf of the Florida Bar,
merit retention system is different from.
Yes, I was just going to say they're not flat out elected. They're retained.
They don't see it that way. I mean, the case that I was before them on was a case in which Florida has a rule that prohibits candidates for the Supreme Court from soliciting, or from any court, from soliciting contributions from lawyers. And that was before the U.S. Supreme Court on a free speech issue. But while I was there, I got some caustic comments about, well, why do you elect your judges? You wouldn't have any problem if you didn't elect them. And I just think they have an attitude about courts that have elected judges.
I want to ask you about that equal protection issue.
Incidentally, can I interrupt for a second?
Sure.
I was one of the prime sponsors of the law that created the current system, where they're appointed and then they just run to be retained or not retained. So I think that's a better system. Given some governors, it gets better all the time. But the thing is that there is no perfect way to pick judges.
That's true.
And merit retention. By the way, merit retention only applies at the appellate level. The reason for that is that when I and my fellow sponsors put the bill in, it covered all levels. But
I forgot to mention that you were a legislator.
Yeah, back in the 70s. And I think this is just an interesting little anecdote. The chair of the House Judiciary Committee was a guy named Billy Joe Risch from Port St. Joe. And among other things, at that time, judges didn't have to have a law degree if the county had less than a certain population. I think originally, originally that was because there weren't enough lawyers in some of the smaller counties. So this bill also fixed that by saying you have to be a lawyer. So Representative Risch had a supporter who was a county court judge who was not a lawyer. And to protect him, he wouldn't let it get out of his committee unless we limited it to the appellate level. Since that time, there have been several efforts to bring it down to the trial level that have not been successful. That's how things happen.
You don't have to be an attorney to be...
You do have to be now.
Oh, okay.
Because once the merit retention bill passed, it did that.
Oh, right.
But that's
a great anecdote. I never knew that. I would have thought you always had to be an attorney to be a judge.
No, we had a number of them who were not lawyers.
We'll talk about
it's more important.
Bringing politics into the courtroom.
It's more important now than it was when the 1885 Constitution was adopted because we have significantly expanded the area in which county court judges can make decisions.
That's true.
And the level of cases and the complexity of cases.
That's very true.
But they all have to be lawyers now.
That's really interesting. I wanted to go back to the equal protection issue because I know I'm not a lawyer. And so don't you love it when people say, no, I'm not a lawyer, and then they say something that makes it sound like they think they're a lawyer? But I really don't think I'm a lawyer either. But this came up the other night during this discussion among lawyers that, if you want to apply equal protection, every county, there was a lot of variance between counties. There's a lot of variance between states in election law, and election systems are different. So it's not just the counting methods that were different in those two counties, but the ways people were voting was different. So how did that equal protection apply just in that one limited instance and not more broadly?
Right, and the opinion said it would only apply in that particular instance.
Right, and I think that was something that Judge Lewis said the other night, that, you can say it's not precedential, but you're really setting precedent. So how does that, and you're an attorney, so explain that to me, because it's kind of hard for me to jibe.
I thought that was the one aspect that flabbergasted lawyers and judges in Florida the most. For the U.S. Supreme Court to issue an opinion and then try to disclaim it as precedent is ludicrous. What that opinion did, and particularly, the dissents by Rehnquist, and I think there were two others with him on the so-called independent state legislature theory, clearly had legs and kept going for a while. The U.S. Supreme Court seems to have rejected it now, many years later. But everything that was said and done in the Bush v. Gore opinion, from Rehnquist's point of view, from the majority point of view, all of those have come back in one way or another, even though the U.S. Supreme Court disclaimed it as precedent. You can't do something and then say it's not going to have an effect in the future. It clearly is going to have an effect in the future. And I think that was part of the slippery slope that took us from Bush v. Gore to what is happening in the United States today. Now, for example, before elections, it's routine for presidential candidates to lawyer up and literally force law firms to decide which candidate they are going to back if there are lawsuits after the election. That was not true before Bush v. Gore.
It became the norm rather than the exception. And that's
yes.
and Judge Roberts said this the other night too. He said that prior to 2000, he was the Division of Elections director at the time. And prior to 2000, he said there were 5 election attorneys in the state and he knew all of them. And now, there's an uncounted number of them. And Jason Unger, who worked on the military ballots for the Bush campaign, he said that candidates now are preparing, they're before elections, they're coming up with their strategies.
You have whole seminars that lawyers go to about election law now that did not exist before Bush v. Gore.
Yeah. Is that a good thing?
Depends on whether you want to get paid.
Billable hours. I know, billable hours, exactly. Barry, right.
Yeah, I'm not looking at it from the billable hour perspective.
I just think it's happening on our with the petition initiatives, and we're seeing a lot of that pre and post litigation. Again, obviously, you want to protect your candidate and ensure that you're well represented. Nobody wants to be in a position where they're running around in Palm Beach County and Gadsden County and trying to figure out who's the nearest lawyer and who can run papers over. That was crazy.
In 2000, I had a client in Switzerland, and I had clients around the world who were calling me and saying, "Hey, I saw you on TV." And so I remember that this particular client said to me, "It just seems so weird to us that you guys have your candidates all have lawyers.
That's funny.
Why is that?"
That's funny. I know, Barry, you have to leave shortly, so and if you can stick around, we'll do some of the fun questions with you before you leave.
I don't know. Can I trust Craig when I'm gone?
We're gonna
what he says.
I'll say.
You
well,
can
if
trust
Barry
me implicitly, Barry.
I'll say if Barry were here, he might ask.
Let me say in that regard, I think I had said earlier, I thought that the U.S. Supreme Court's equal protection decision was a sensible decision. I still believe that's true. I do understand Craig's point, however. I think the primary criticism of them was not that the analysis itself was flawed, but that why did they even engage in the analysis? There were many people who expected, including, by the way, the Bush team, that they would never take the case because it was the type of case that forever they had said is a political case and that we're not going to get involved in it. So that's what the criticism, and that's a fair question.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't disagree on that.
If a similar case were to arise today in the hyper-partisan environment that we're in, do you think the institutions, the courts, the elections systems, the media are prepared to handle it?
What gives me hope is the results that we've gotten from a lot of judges, no matter what party appointed them and no matter what president appointed them or governor appointed them, who have been making decisions over and over again. They get reversed often, but they're making decisions that take a lot of courage. Part of the problem is that we have seen, in my mind, a significant deterioration in the criteria being used to appoint judges. I mean, Bush's appointments, I don't mean Bush, I mean Trump's appointments, basically people who we think will be loyal to him.
Loyalists.
And then you have this
and who are relatively young.
This recent announcement that the Justice Department is going to start looking at what they call rogue judges. What that means is judges who don't do what we want them to do.
Yeah.
That's one of the first steps towards the loss of democracy.
Very frightening.
And so my answer is, if we have judges, and by the way, we have had many instances in history where judges have risen above the political backgrounds that got them appointed to do the right thing. That's happened over and over again. And so I can't assume that because of who appointed them. And we've seen it in Florida, by the way. We've seen some very fine judges and justices who were appointed by people who thought they were going to do one thing and they ended up doing another thing. So I don't know. I hope that we can continue, because the judiciary is the bastion of liberty. They're the ones who stand in the way of the destruction of our basic liberties. Right. So I hope that we will continue to see what we've seen in the last several years, which is judges standing up to abuse of authority.
How about you?
Yeah, I have seen judges who have risen above, the ideologies of the governors or the presidents who have appointed them. I mean, my boss for many years, Gerald Cogan, was selected for the Florida Supreme Court by Governor Bob Martinez because he was perceived as a tough on crime conservative. And when he came to the Florida Supreme Court over time, he became regarded as one of the liberals, along with people like Rosemary Barquette and Barbara Perriente. Mm-hmm. And so once you are in that position, you do have a little more freedom to act on your conscience as you interpret the law and what it means. I think that's one of the great aspects of our system, is that we do have some degree of judicial independence at every level of state government. My big fear is that judges will cave to public relations campaigns based on intimidation and threats. I've been very concerned at what I've seen at the national level with some of the judges who have been threatened and who have had aggressive acts against them of different kinds. And that's something. Those kind of tactics are clearly designed to intimidate judges. And so I share Barry's concern that we could lose our democracy if judges aren't willing to make the sacrifices necessary to stand up, even if it means the end of their careers.
Well, I guess, and with federal judges, they have lifetime appointments. But if we're going to set a new standard where we're going to go after quote unquote rogue judges, then does that undermine your confidence that judges are going to, that they're going to be standing up to do the right thing, or to, ensure that the rule of law is protected?
Well, we'll see. Incidentally, the reason that you often see judges change from what was expected of them is because they're confronted with circumstances that were unanticipated. And the most famous example of that was Earl Warren. Earl Warren was considered to be a staunch conservative. And this was in the days that we still had the vestiges of slavery, where blacks had to use different fountains, go to different men's rooms, couldn't live in white neighborhoods. And Warren ended up presiding over a monumental change in the law with regard to civil rights. We had the separate but equal doctrine that said that you could require blacks to go to separate schools as long as they were equal. And the Supreme Court declined to do it. It was the Warren Court that said, that doesn't work. That's a violation of of equal protection. And they went on to preside over enormous changes to protect, in those cases, Black Americans. But they apply to everybody who's a minority. That's not because all of a sudden, and I remember when there were billboards all over the state, and this is impeach Earl Warren.
Right.
The whole court was conservative, incidentally, and became what everybody considered to be liberal. That wasn't because suddenly they woke up one morning and said, I'm going to be liberal. It's because they were confronted with such a vicious violation of the principles stated in our Constitution. They didn't have a choice.
Right.
And that's what happens. Suddenly a person gets on a court and they say, I know but you know, conservative and liberal just depend on what it is. You know, it depends on what the circumstances are. There are people who believe they're very conservative when it comes to fiscal responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
They're conservative when it comes to certain issues and liberal when it comes to how you treat people. So when I was in the legislature back in the 70s, I found there were two types of legislators. There was the type who, with every bill to come before him or her, in those days it was mostly him, they would say, well, I'm a conservative or I'm a liberal. Where does this fall on the spectrum? And it was easy for them because once they made that decision, they knew how to vote. And then there were the people, it was harder because they said, I'm going to look at everything and say what makes the most sense. And neither end has a monopoly on what makes sense. And it's harder to make that decision. And one of the reasons it's harder is because you incur the wrath of one end or the other end. So I'm very proud of my wife, incidentally, because she does that. She doesn't pick one side.
For those of you
other.
who don't know, our divas are a very sophisticated bunch of listeners. But for those of you who don't know, Barry's wife is State Representative Allison Tant. I had the pleasure of seeing her yesterday at an event. She was on a panel I was emceeing. She's also been a guest on the Deeper Dive. And she is a rock star. And also, she's a former chair of the Florida Democratic Party. And so you guys are kind of like Florida, Tallahassee's own, I guess a lot of people don't remember who they are, Mary Madeline and James Carville. I've always thought of you in that way because you represented the Bush campaign. And so
I am a Democrat, though.
Barry is hardly Mary.
No, that's true. That's true. That's true. Just on paper.
I don't want the show to become a thing on Allison, but the fact is, it's just an example of what I'm saying, that you end up in the middle if you try. Yeah. Listen, she beat a Republican in Jefferson County, which is heavily Republican.
That's right.
If you went into Madison County, it was interesting. You would see Trump and Tant yard side by side. We need more people like that.
She's a rock star in Madison County because she helped out after the hurricane there.
We need more people who look at every issue for what makes sense.
Yeah. I also will say that that Judge Lewis the other day said that there were some complaints about media coverage, and I don't remember when Allison was chair, and I don't believe it was during the time of the recount. It was much later.
No, it was after.
Yeah.
And she was never politically oriented. She was urged by people to take over, and she did it.
No, the reason that I mentioned this is because he said that there were errors, and everyone said that I did a great job, but that there were numerous errors in the reporting at the time, including somebody wrote something about Terry Lewis's wife, that she was active in Democratic politics. And he said it was completely the opposite. She was completely uninterested. And I said, oh, they maybe had you confused with Barry Richards. So I don't. She's an extraordinary woman. I'm proud of her. And we actually see pretty much the same on most issues. And one of the reasons is because doesn't she blame you for the recount? She blame you for?
I remember at one point a prominent reporter in Tallahassee said to her, "What is Barry doing?" And she said, "He's practicing law."
That's right.
And I think, by the way, one of the good things that came out of 2000,
Yeah.
the average person had no idea what happens in a courtroom. And I think it taught people two things. One of them was it taught them what happens in a courtroom. What the lawyers, you don't retry a case with all the evidence when you go at the appellate level. They suddenly realize that. The second thing was it taught them that lawyers represent clients, and it doesn't mean that they agree with the client. It just means that that's their job, and that's what we have to do if the system's going to work.
Yeah.
So I didn't have. There are some clients I would not represent because I have the right. I remember my opponent David Boies was interviewed once, and he was saying, "Would you represent anybody?" And he said no. And they said, "Well, he said I wouldn't represent a skinhead." And they said, "Well, I thought lawyers were supposed to represent anybody." And he said, "I don't have to. Anybody has the right to hire a lawyer."
Right.
And he said, "Yes, but not this lawyer." So we all have the ability to draw lines.
You can say no. Right.
There are certain people I would not represent, but not because they're a Republican or a Democrat or a conservative or a liberal.
Would you represent a skinhead?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't have any. I don't do criminal, so I probably wouldn't. But
what if it were a First Amendment issue?
You know what? Not likely. It just, there are certain people who I just don't want to be involved with. But most of what I do is a different level.
Yeah.
I represent, handle complex commercial litigation and constitutional law and election law, and I don't get involved with people at that level. Not because I don't think they're entitled to lawyers, just not this lawyer.
Yeah. That's not this layer. All right. Well, let me ask you a few questions and then we're going to let you go. And then Craig and I are going to finish up with a little bit more about the court and the working and the media and the technology. Okay. Favorite phone app?
You mean of all the apps on my phone?
Yes.
I can't answer that question. They all serve different purposes.
Okay.
And I
How
have
about
a favorite app depending upon what the purpose is.
Okay. That's a good answer. Very, very lawyerly, very political. Yeah. Very.
I mean, I'm an Apple person.
Yes, I am too. How about, I'm in a bad marriage with Apple. I can't, all my devices are Apple. So now I'm forever married to Apple. How about you? Favorite app?
Well, the one I use the most is Google because
Google.
I'm always, I was just looking up to get Ben Ginsburg's name.
Oh, right.
And so I'm always using my phone for that.
Okay. Well, we're coming into the holiday season here. So I'm going to ask you a couple. Is it dressing or stuffing?
It depends on where you put it.
Okay.
If you actually stuff the bird with it, it's stuffing. The problem with doing that is it may not cook all the way through.
Right.
So most people don't actually stuff the bird.
Okay.
They bake it in a separate pan and then it's called dressing.
Okay. Preference on dressing or stuffing?
I have none, and I just learned something new.
Me too. Okay, cranberry sauce, yay or nay?
You mean, do I like it or not?
Yes.
I love it if it's done right.
Oh, not out of the can.
I don't like
just
to come out of the can in the shape of a barrel.
Right, exactly.
I had a really good one yesterday at a Thanksgiving.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Nice. How about you?
I love the version I make myself.
Okay, well, we'll get you that recipe after we let Barry go. Roasted turkey or fried turkey?
I generally don't eat fried foods, so the answer is roasted.
Of course he doesn't. You're from Pensacola. How about you?
Roasted, although, I've got friends over there who always fry, so I will eat it.
All right, and do you have a favorite?
I will say if I'm going to eat fried foods, it's not likely to be turkey. It's likely to be like fried oysters from Shell's Oyster Bar or something like that.
All right, let me turn that up a little bit, and we'll give you that on your last. Thank you very much. Barry Richard, thank you very much. Craig Roberts, we'll be right back with you. And that is the first half of our Deeper Dive.
Thanks for listening to Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by the News Service of Florida, hosted by News Service senior writer Dara Cam and produced by me, Mike Exline. Music for the podcast was recorded by Periodic Labs, LLC.